Hi, Dana. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this book, I'm just started the second chapter. It's a very interesting look at the New York Times, and I have to ask you, what brought you to focus on the New York Times for this book?
Well, my last book was Coloring the News, and that was about political correctness in the newsroom generally throughout America.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, when you're talking about the media, the New York Times is the flagship. It is the Harvard of the news media, and unfortunately, it is probably the biggest example and most influential example of political correctness and an array of institutional problems that affect the Fourth Estate in general. So it was a natural to follow up with Gray Lady Down, and what I tried to do was assess how bad its coverage is, how bad the institutional embarrassments have been, how bad the frauds and con jobs and ruses and manipulations it's fallen for, and the people and the policies behind it.
Now, what do they do? What does the New York Times do? And I look at it. I used to go to the New York Times website when I first started, when I was in college and studying print journalism. I don't really read the New York Times anymore because I think that they just I find them to be biased. But when you look at the New York Times, having studied them for so long, what is the first thing that pops out to you in the way in which they approach coverage of various issues?
Let me back up and just say I've been reading it every day since my sixth grade teacher, Ed O'Neill, assigned it to us. I'm from New York. I was published very prominently in the Times at the beginning of my career, although I was never a staff reporter there. I did write for them. I read it with, I guess what you'd say, a pair of corrective lenses. I read it every day. Unfortunately, what I see is this kind of, I think the phrase that captures it best is a phrase that a former think tank president and currently an author, James Pearson, calls punitive liberalism. And what that means is a kind of attitude towards America, its norms, its values, its institutions, and its history, in which America is seen as the bad guy, or only the bad things are accented and the good things are kind of forgotten. And if anything creates a through line that most of the problems with the coverage of the New York Times emanates from, I would say it's that punitive liberalism.
What happened to get the New York Times on a trajectory like that? I mean, if they were the flagship at one point, they were the gold standard in American journalism. At what point did they start to go downhill? At what point did this change?
Well, it changed. Probably, if you were going to mark it on a timeline, you'd say it changed after the tenure of Abe Rosenthal, A.M. Rosenthal, who was the executive editor for almost 20 years, and had a very agnostic view of news coverage. You know, he basically said, let the facts be told and let the chips fall where they may. And they used to use a phrase at the time, the old Yiddish expression called talking tachlis, meaning, basically acknowledging tough truths, potent but unpalatable truths. After Rosenthal left, the new editors had a much softer view of news. There were three things that came in after that. They allowed much more opinion to leak out of the editorial pages onto the new pages, a lot more subjectivity born of the new journalism. They had a lot more soft news coverage, which in looking at trends and other kinds of social and cultural news, kind of opened up a back door towards countercultural values. It opened up a back door towards a celebration of the transgressive, of the traditional. And then the third thing was the rise of Arthur Sulzberger Jr. and his agenda, particularly his agenda to diversify the newspaper. Now, there's nothing wrong with collecting a greater variety of news reporters. Newsrooms used to be too white and too male. Unfortunately, Arthur's diversity agenda doesn't acknowledge ideological diversity, and in bringing in a diverse group of reporters, they basically brought in a very uniform set of thinkers who are captive of a liberal orthodoxy that acknowledges diversity over anything else.
Wow. Do they still think that what they do is news, like objective news?
A lot of it is. I can't say that everything they do is horrible, and I will scold you. You should read the New York Times. Okay?
Well, I take that back. I read it as a part of what I do for big journalism.
Right. Well, that's everybody reads it for a different reason.
Right.
But I think that when they do, they are perfectly capable of doing very objective journalism. However, when you get into issues like race, immigration, gay rights, highlights Islamic immigration, the war on terrorism, the war in Iraq, then you wind up with some trouble. Those are the hot-button issues that they have a real problem with, that you see their bias is so obvious, that the warpedness of their coverage is so undeniable that you can't help but think this isn't reporting, this is propaganda.
And they don't realize that it is, I'm sure.
Well, they live in an ideological bubble,
right.
And like things and they, as much as they pay lip service to trying to bring a broad variety of people into the newsroom. Essentially, they're self-selecting, right. And they define the kind of journalistic values that they care for in a way that can't possibly but enforce a kind of ideological orthodoxy.
Now, what kind of effect did this have on media in America? If the New York Times had at one point been considered the gold standard, they were the flagship. How did this sort of have a domino effect in how other newsrooms approached news gathering?
Yes, well, two ways in particular. Sulzberger's diversity agenda was adopted as the industry standard by the rest of the newspaper industry and a lot of electronic media as well. So he put a lot of the New York Times institutional credibility and power on the line within the industry to advance this agenda, which I think has had a uniforming effect on thinking in newsrooms, and not a broadening, certainly not a diversifying effect. Secondly, another big problem that was behind Sulzberger's tenure was the idea of giving away information free on the net. Basically, giving away the New York Times for free. Sulzberger believed in the internet ideology that information should be free. He overruled an internal task force dating to about 1995, which recommended that they charge, and he said, no, we're going to give it away for free. The rest of the industry followed, and we are where we are now. The ad revenues are just not enough to sustain quality news gathering.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, there's so many different. I think there's still a lot of room for models to people for folks to approach in terms of making money off of the news because I think a lot of people, when they're used to having it for free for so long, they'll just sort of run from having to pay from something that used to be free. But I want to ask you, with the New York Times, is there, when you look at the New York Times and you look at its effect on media across the country, do you, from your perspective and everything that you have seen, do you think that there is a chance for recovery, a chance for media to attain its original purpose?
Well, I do, and I think this is where the new models might come in. I think that there's always a new leadership, particularly at the Times, might help with recovery, so to speak. But like any addict, Times might make pledges of sobriety, but it falls off the wagon with great regularity. And a lot of these pledges have come in the wake of the Jason Blair's plagiarism scandal, dating back from 2003, 2004. When you mention new models, there is a lot of lip service paid to these new models, but we still haven't seen one that really works and really generates the revenue that's going to establish the coverage that we need, particularly foreign news. I mean, we're living in a society that's never been as globalized, and where we've never had as many foreign economic and political and military commitments. And yet the quality of our foreign news is declining, mostly because it's so expensive to gather. So
right.
Somebody's got to come up with a model that's going to replace the old, let's throw $1 million at the Jerusalem, bureau, or let's throw $1 million at the New Delhi bureau. Somebody's got to come up with something, and hopefully the net will provide,
right.
I think, a catalytic force. I don't think it'll just be the internet, but I think it'll be a catalyst that print and video will kind of come around and sort of cluster around.
Yeah, last question for you on this, and this sort of kind of dovetails into what we were just discussing with this last question. Do you think that do we lack a gold standard for journalism right now, or do you think that citizen journalism, one of the things that we've been seeing from Twitter or from Facebook or blogging, do you think that would fill that role?
No, not at all. I don't think Twitter and Facebook fit that at all. I think the gold standard right now, the best newspaper in the country is the Wall Street Journal, nationally speaking. However, it needs to maintain its own standards and to bring the non-business reader into the business world. I used to love those corporate anthropologies, I used to call them, where you get a 5,000-word newspaper article that would take you in to a business drama, and as a layperson, you'd be able to understand it. if the Times can recover its old agnosticism and start reporting, facts over advancing its political values, there's still a tremendously powerful and important paper there.
Absolutely.
I'm not a revolutionary. I'm a reformer.
Right. I love the Wall Street Journal. I read that daily. William McGowan, Gray Lady Down, What the Decline and Fall of the New York Times Means for America. Thanks so much for your time this afternoon. This is a great book. It's a very interesting read.
Thanks very much. And the website is grayladydown.net.